Welcome to the third episode of my historical exploration series on the Graveyard from the massively multiplayer text-based game GemStone III. I'm the player Xorus. In the introduction video, I explained the out-of-game motivation for this history series, and then, in the second episode, I restored the archaic context of the Graveyard. These were fundamental factual details about the world setting of Calthea, which in the dead language of Heretic means Shadow World. The world setting in the Ice Age of GemStone III was Calthea, not Atlanthea. Though to keep things from being too easy to keep straight, it was also Atlanthea during GemStone II, which was before the Ice Age. Sometimes people get confused and think the Ice Age was GemStone II. It wasn't. GemStone III was half Calthea, half Atlanthea. GemStone IV is just a major game mechanics overhaul of GemStone III. The world setting of GemStone IV is total continuity with GemStone III. GemStone II has almost no continuity with GemStone III and IV, and I know vanishingly little about it. Though a few things, like Helga and the Hanging Inn, were carried over from GemStone II. That shared Thea ending on Calthea and Atlanthea is eyebrow-raising, since Atlanthea predates the Ice Age by roughly a year, and the Shadow World Master Atlas was early 1989. But if Atlanthea was supposed to mean something, and I don't know if it does, I would only be able to offer speculations on the meaning of Elan. Elan is a word out of French, for example, meaning spirited or with enthusiasm. The word originated in lance throwing. I'll be bringing up foreign languages and subtle word plays in the crypto history episodes. Regardless, I would suggest watching that second episode titled Ice Orientation before this one, as this episode is more advanced. And as soon as you understand much of what was in the previous episode about Shadow World. When comparing the ice source material to what exists in the Graveyard or its backstory, the legend of the necropolis of Etrivion, it becomes immediately apparent that many of the details are backwards or wrong in some way. Some of them are subtly wrong. Others are blatantly, glaringly wrong. So wrong they must be intentionally wrong. When I construct the theory of the Graveyard's subtextual narrative in the later videos, starting with the next episode, you will see this backwardness is also present on the allegorical level of interpretation, assuming my theory is more or less right, of course. This is not an isolated conceit of the Graveyard. It was done in several permanent areas made in the 1990s. And if I do more of these historical series for other parts of GemStone, such as the Broken Lands, for example, this everything is wrong or inverted theme will come up repeatedly. These places where it happens are all unsurprisingly related to the Graveyard on some level, though these are exceptionally subtle relationships. This is a treacherous way of resolving why things do not make sense, because as a theory, these parts of it are just wrong, is overpowered. But it's the most parsimonious way to parse those places, that some aspects are flipped, made backwards from what ought to be. In the second episode, I also highlighted some of the more subtle details encoded in the room design of the Graveyard. These included the Graveyard Gate, the now broken blind spot rooms, as I call them, and how space is warped in the Graveyard. The Graveyard, notably, is not actually enclosed if you limit yourself to looking at only the rooms that existed in the Ice Age. But I think it is highly likely that if you did try to wander in or out without using the gate, then in principle, spatial warps would turn you around and send you back, like they do in the Graveyard's mazes. There's no way to know, of course, because if that's the intent, it is purely implicit. So it might actually be enclosed with the false appearance of endlessness, which in the death episode I will argue is symbolic. I also interpreted some implicit aspects, such as how trespassers likely got trapped underground, and how the ghouls are most likely implicitly supposed to be failed grave robbers. That is, inferring from the source material to make those conclusions. The fourth episode will be about death in GemStone and how that relates to the Graveyard, as the Graveyard and the death mechanics are about as old as each other, and I think they are symbolically related, as I just said. In the last part of this series, I will explore an allegorical interpretation of the graveyard. As I noted near the end of the second episode, Bander designed the necropolis in three distinct styles: an Egyptian mastaba, a passage barrow or Viking ship burial, and an English medieval manor. These do not make much sense in the Shadow World context. Their significance seems to be in their out-of-game meanings, which is to say, I think there is an OOG dimension to why those were chosen by the creators. In the allegorical interpretation, I will be offering an explanation for how that all ties together in a grand design of the graveyard. This will blow you away. It is either dead on right about the higher concept, or an utterly diabolically clever way of being completely wrong. In this episode, I will be exploring the Shadow World setting more deeply than I did in the second episode. While we know that the I.C.E. source books were used in designing the story in the graveyard, we do not necessarily know which ones were used, or which parts, except in obvious cases. If you consider the Shadow World books to be an text, or a theory forming a kind of parallel to what exists in the game, you have to recognize that a lot of it was not intended to be relevant by the creators. There are potential connections that are not supposed to be connections. We could construct arguments about what ought to be true by internal consistency of the world setting, but the creators might not have considered the things we come up with, or those considerations might be leading away from the intended point. That is a valid argument within that context, perhaps, but a false path heading toward a dead end, because it's putting too much weight on that aspect of things. GemStone, again, is its own instance. Things that are so in canon may not be so in GemStone. The parallel has to break down at some point, so we have to figure out when to stop pulling the threads. This is a very difficult thing to do in general because it's very easy to seduce yourself by getting enamored with your own ideas. What I will be doing in this episode is holding up some parts of the Shadow World setting and in an ironic, contingent way asking, what if it were the case that this part of the world setting was relevant? I'm skeptical that this is an especially useful way of interpreting a graveyard. The prevalence of the everything is wrong theme undermines the world setting mattering very heavily, and as I will argue, I think the higher concept is off-canon and better understood as allegory. But we have to explore the world logic to figure out how far to take it. What we are most interested in is the weirdness in how the Lords of Essence are treated by the story. That Bander pledged himself to Empress Kadaena, who had been dead for 100,000 years, and as she was being conflated with the Lords of Orhan, who are now called the Lords of Liabo in the Atlantean world setting, implying there was a faction of dark gods who split off from them, but who cannot be the Dark Lords of Kuron or Shuron, depending on how you want to pronounce that, what we now call Lornon, because that pantheon did not exist yet in early enough books. So, who might this be referencing? Is it just referring to her nameless followers, merely conflating the Essence Lords and the Lords of Orhan? Then there is Kestrel. Kestrel's so-called kingdom was a small fiefdom granted by some higher figure in the forces of the Unlife. Which begs the question, who was Kestrel's liege lord? Similarly, who was Kestrel invading in the campaign that resulted in the fiefdom, and who invaded their border at the end? There are possibilities for these things, but it requires going deeper into the world logic, into stuff not actually mentioned in the story, subtext involving Shadow World, and indeed it might not actually matter even if we can put names to some of these things. There are also other more subtle things about the room painting in the graveyard that I only glossed over, other examples of things being backwards or wrong in some way. There are some more advanced geographical considerations to review for the continent Jaimon in the process of answering these questions, along with contextualizing some vestigial source material, which do not sound quite right, having originated in older ice books. This will be deep into the most obscure depths, surely well beyond the scope of the authorial intent. Unfortunately, there's no obvious way this should all be organized, so I will just break it up into major sections and bounce around as needed. We will start with trying to understand what the deal is with the long-dead Empress Kadaena having a theocracy during the Wars of Dominion. Kadaena is seemingly treated as a goddess of death by Bander's theocracy, but she would also have to be a dead goddess. This is common enough in real-world mythology, but it does not come from Shadowworld. Bander pledged himself to her, and in the death episode I will argue that certain words, like homage or fief, might have been intended by the creators to be taken in their literal medieval meanings, in which case it is especially weird. Kadaena should somehow still be leading in the Wars of Dominion, even though she is dead. Moving back to the scroll room in the graveyard crypt, I spoke on the Shulk manuscript with her insignia, whatever that is, in the second episode, but I ignored the library seal on it, which says it is from the Library of Namikos. Namikos manuscripts are big, heavy books a few feet wide, like medieval illuminated manuscripts, not something easily hidden in the folds of your robes. So it's kind of weird he was able to steal this, but failed at stealing the speaking crystal. Originally this would have just said, "It reads." The common language thing is a much later game mechanic, allowing writing in different languages. Common itself is probably a vestigial holdover from the Ice Age when what are now humans were common men in game mechanics. For several years after the de-ice, the racial languages gave the archaic race names when you swapped languages, or were right when you were actually speaking. That aspect of it was presumably hard-coded at a deeper level, and they were apparently unable to change it until later. You are now speaking High Elven, for example, but then you spoke, and it was you say in Dark Elven. Recall that the poem on the ceiling of the false door room does not have this language mechanic. It still says only, "It reads." Today the seal says, "Property of the Library of Biblia, Reference Department, do not remove." This was included as an Easter egg on writable books that were handed out from the Teleportation Review release event a couple of years ago. The Library of Biblia was seen through a portal where it had a chronomage obelisk in front of it. Chronomages are the replacement concept for the Navigator Guilds from Shadowworld, and the GMs occasionally make throwback references to ICE stuff as homages. The Library of Biblia is now a chronomage facility. Someone stole a book of theirs on time magic, and counterfeits of it had this message in them. There was even a library guard specializing in unarmed combat who had an eye tattoo that was clearly based on the Shangri-Mai eye tattoos. But in the graveyard, this originally said Library of Namikos, not Library of Biblia. This is something else that is wrong. The reference section in the Library of Namikos is part of the public collection, and the Jaimon source book explicitly says that no original manuscripts are kept in this part of the library, only copies of generic reference material like atlases. This manuscript is a First Era relic and would have been stolen from one of the vaults in the special collection. It would not have been in the reference department. No one would have been able to get close enough to it to see such a seal, and nobody is allowed to remove anything from Namikos regardless. Only the scribes handle the materials. Browsing is not allowed. Something more subtle is that the manuscripts are laid out in niches in the Library of Namikos. That could be an influence factor for the niche in the Crypt scroll room. Though, as you'll see later, I have another, more striking model to motivate that particular detail. The same detail can be explained within different frames of reference, and it might be that only one of them was intended, but it might also be that the same detail is multi-referential, having more than one layer of meaning. The scroll room is quite complex in this way. So, the scroll room is strange in that it is unplundered, and the room painting dictates that you do not try to touch the forbidden knowledge, thinking better of it. As I said in the second episode, these background objects are probably cursed and would likely transport you into the deep underground section. I will strengthen the reasoning for that speculation in the death episode. Lastly, I ignored the strangely compelling volume, which is a copy of the book Banner wrote that gained him unlimited access to Namikos. It is titled Servants of the Shadow, Power Through Thraldom. The academic titles on it might not mean anything. HS, MCL, RLN, RSTLNE. Well, okay, maybe not that one. Some people have speculated MCL means Master of the Council of Light, but the graveyard is maybe half a year older than the Council of Light, and I very much doubt they are significantly related. The Council of Light is very shallow and seems to be something they just let Robert Woodhead build, who had been a GemStone II player. From what I've heard, it doesn't sound like he was heavy into the ice books, and the Society isn't heavy into them. The graveyard, in contrast, has a great deal of subtlety in it. The styles are completely different. The LN in RLN would probably be Library of Namikos, and the CL is more likely College of Loremasters. But whatever these stand for exactly would have to be revealed by the creators. There's no way to really guess it. These might be intended as fake academic credentials. There is nothing in the story suggesting Banner spent time in colleges earning degrees. Power through thraldom is probably referring to the way people become enslaved by the Unlife from drawing on its power. That is, those who follow the dark path, corrupting themselves with evil spells. There may be some allegorical significance in the word thraldom, which I will address in later videos. More broadly, there is a hierarchy of subjugation in the forces of the Unlife. Lesser undead obeying greater undead, lesser demons obeying greater demons, that kind of thing. That may or may not be relevant, but it is a recurring motif in the bestiaries. Then you have the Wars of Dominion and so on. Servants of the Shadow is another matter entirely. This title is quoting from the same brief whirlwind history section of the adventure modules that conflates the Lords of Essence with the Lords of Orhan. That is, the only place anywhere where Kadaena is conflated with the Lords of Orhan, other than the Legend of the Necropolis of Atrivion story, is in the Kelborn book, for example. It's usually around page 3 or 4. Great demons were fashioned by the most powerful of the lords who had fallen under the influence of the Unlife, led by the Empress Kadaena. Wise but twisted in spirit, the servants of the Shadow offered knowledge beyond that which the Loremasters deigned to give such lesser beings, and the power of the Unlife grew unfettered in the Second Era. It's immediately clear this is why the Graveyard's backstory speaks of Kadaena being the first Lord of Orhan to follow the Unlife. The first paragraph makes it sound like the Lords are the Lords of Orhan, and as an in-character NPC view, this would probably be someone who wrongly thinks the Lords of Orhan are Essence Lords posing as gods. This is actually vestigial text from older ice books before the Shadow Rolemaster Atlas. In those books, the demonic were created artificially by the Lords of Essence and later came under the sway of the Unlife. That's why it is speaking of the Lords fashioning great demons, which probably more specifically refers to the Ordainers, who can immolate themselves in fire or ice. That was outmoded by the 1989 books, but sometimes text that is carried forward has some weirdness, not sounding right in the later context. So the first servants of the Unlife in canon begin appearing in the Second Era of Shadow World. Empress Kadaena and her followers were over 100,000 years earlier. However, the portals made by the Lords of Essence are what weaken the barriers between planes, allowing the anti-essence of the Unlife to enter this world. And there's no question she and her followers used dark essence, demons, evil spell lists, and so on, and were corrupted by it. There's a line in the Master Atlas saying only the Dragon Lords have been able to use its power and keep their free wills, though in later books they are walked away from the Unlife, and their powers are more indirectly from chaos. From 1990 onward, Shadow World becomes multi-factional, while in 1989 and earlier, the Unlife is the big bad. It is wrong in the strictest sense to say Kadaena was a servant of the Unlife, but she might as well have been, the way she destroyed the world. And the Unlife is the source of all true evil in 1989, whether its servants know it or not. In this weird brief whirlwind history from the adventure modules, the Unlife was influencing her and the Lords of Essence way back in the First Era. Except the earlier paragraph conflates them with the Lords of Orhan, which the Master Atlas explicitly refutes. This text is arguably an in-character view of the history and can be interpreted as flawed. This freak flare of the essence explanation of the Lords is totally wrong. So, brief aside, I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial. The ICE source books, generally speaking, are GM reference materials. They're for people playing tabletop, like Dungeons & Dragons, giving prefabricated campaign setting stuff to game masters. Some of the material is written in an in-character frame of reference, which the GM could distribute to player characters. Unless the players are metagaming, they're not supposed to know the stuff the GM knows. So there's lots of Shadow World lore that is supposed to be GM knowledge, not player character knowledge, unless knowing it is justified. This stuff is supposed to be objectively true, notwithstanding these highly arcane nuances I'm bringing up. In the Atlantean world setting of Gemstone, our official documentation is not of this kind. With the sole exception of the Kiramon document, which has a disclaimer at the top saying characters should not know this information in this form, and some mechanics information. Official documents in Atlantia are things a character could pick up off a shelf in a library. Whether they have listed NPC authors or not, they are written within the world setting, and they are biased or fallible. There are contradictory dates, sometimes major inconsistencies. The religious lore isn't even remotely consistent, but it doesn't need to be. It's prehistorical legend. The information in documents is sometimes outdated, because they're what I call fixed elements in the second episode, and transient things happen that supersedes them. Later stuff has to be allowed to supersede earlier stuff, so we have to keep things in chronological order, like the time horizons you see me doing with the graveyard and the ICE source books, so that we're not reading anachronisms into things. Generally speaking, we do not go back and change documents. We come out with new documents or rarely come out with new versions of existing documents. I'm opposed to making micro edits to fix old documents. That is, without including revision dates or new version dates. It's less of an issue with the wiki, which has a changelog, but everything should have a corresponding date. And my attitude is, if it's wrong, it's just wrong. The NPC author just made a mistake. Inconsistencies have largely been avoided because new documents often have minimal overlap with the subjects of other documents. I'm not in the habit of shining spotlights on documentation inconsistencies because it's mostly harmless when people do not notice them. Now, there's surely stuff on the back end that could qualify as intended to be objectively true. Notes left on original intent. Maybe stuff that is on the GM wiki. But players can't see any of that. The lore we are able to access has to be regarded as possibly flawed in various ways. And that's not a real problem. That's more realistic for the world setting. But back on topic. We're talking about what's wrong with the brief whirlwind history section of the adventure modules, especially with Empress Kadaena, and what about it has support in other texts from 1989. Something else it does is speak of Empress Kadaena leading these forces during the Second Era, even though she was killed in the First Era. This is not an isolated instance. There are multiple cases in the 1989 books where Kadaena is conflated with the Wars of Dominion. In the 1990 books onward, these cases were rewritten to say Final Conflict, meaning the First Era Civil War. But there is some precedent in the 1989 books for referring to the forces of the Unlife as servants of Kadaena, even though it was obviously wrong even in the context of those books. You can see it here in the Jaimon book from 1989 with the servants of Kadaena in the Wars of Dominion and an artifact called the Amulet of Karon. Again, this was before there was a pantheon of dark gods defined on that moon. In 1989, it was mostly associated with the forces of the Unlife. You also see it here in the Inhabitants Guide from 1989 on flame souls, flame demons that were bodyguards of Kadaena. By the Master Atlas Addendum in 1990, Wars of Dominion here is fixed, changed to Final Conflict. Back in the Weird Whirlwind History section, it talks about evil cults and orders. In its older context, this was really talking about the Iron Wind. I'll talk more about them later in this episode, but they are really the only group in Shadow World that does this. Servants of the Unlife who pose as wise, learned men, offering knowledge that the Loremasters refuse to share with lesser races. As I mentioned previously, the Loremasters are predominantly Ilyari, or Ilari, the High Elves. They do have some Sage Mortal members. This is another point of weirdness in the Whirlwind history. It speaks of the Loremasters as perhaps descended from the Lords. The real sense of this is that Andrax, a surviving cousin of Kadaena, is secretly a Lord of Essence. In fact, beginning in 1990, I think, Andrax is the son of Utha, who decapitated Kadaena. That detail at least is right. It is kept in later Shadow World books. The Loremasters have nothing directly to do with the Lords of Orhan, though those gods did finally intervene and ended the Wars of Dominion. But if you look in the Lord High Cleric office in the Landing Temple, you see reference to the Lords of Liabo and their sages, where sages is the de-ice term for Loremasters. This makes no sense in terms of canon. It has to be based on the same weird text as the Servants of the Shadow line in the Graveyard, and it's one of the reasons I think the two places are related. Recall that Bander is the Lord High Sorcerer of the Dark Path when you look at the inscription on the crypt. I would even go so far as to say that the Lord High Cleric office is probably an anti-parallel, that is, an inverted mirror, of the crypt scroll room. The way this monk is described strongly suggests he is Shangramai, like the guards at the Library of Namikos, who apprehended Bander for stealing relics from the library, including the manuscript in the crypt. So, while these things were obviously wrong in the context of the Master Atlas in 1989, the creators intentionally leaned into this off-canon version of the history. The last thing I will note about the scroll room for now, as just kind of an aside, is more a matter of crypto history. Notice that the Servants of the Shadow book in the wall niche is called a strangely compelling volume. Now look at Castle Anwen, released in December 1997 as part of the Vrail Quest. The phrase strangely compelling in the niche is borrowed in the pentagram cavern with the serpentine mirror and locked chest. There are even Archwights and moaning spirits in Castle Anwen. This chest is where the Vrail scroll was found in the Castle Anwen Demon Queen storyline following the Vrail Quest. The scroll was violent, powered with anti-mana, and dominated the will of an NPC named Narandar. It was physically changing him and his personality, causing amnesia effects. It made him obsessed and so on, reminiscent of Bander. Their names are even similar. Narandar, Bander. It was presumably Tirati's Vrail scroll, however you pronounce that. Tirate, like obliterate, or Tirata, the ancient Greek word for signs and omens, translated as wonders in the Bible. From Terras, the word for monster. That's not ridiculous, by the way. I tracked down former GM Afer a few years ago. He confirmed he was naming things in archaic languages at the time, though I don't know if Tirate or Tirat or whatever was one of those things. Some of the Castle Anwen creatures, for example, are words or probably made from words in Latin. Dafran Ilion is clearly ancient Greek. The spelling is just slightly tweaked. Anwen itself is Welsh. See, this is why I'm trying to avoid doing brief asides. But in any case, what you see in the lore song on his Void Blade, the scrolls left at the castle by an elderly wandering journeyman who died overnight. This scroll transformed his mother, the Queen of Anwen, into a demon in whatever sense, or so I have read. The Demon Queen storyline is poorly recorded. There are almost no logs. But there are multiple cases of Vrail Quest associated rooms that are arguably made as parallels to the graveyard. I will not be getting into that in any depth in this history series, because the subject is too involved, like with Shadow Valley. I would cover it if I were doing one of these on the Vrail Quest, which had some subtle stuff in it, but it's fairly difficult to figure out without reading hidden patterns into the television static. The ideal person to tell me I'm wrong about that would be former GM Teleri, who was a history guru in the late 90s and made the areas I'm talking about. I'm not sure how she pronounces that word, Taleri or Talairi. It is Heretic, meaning the half-forevers, the Shadow World word for half-elves. So let's pull back for a bit and consider the broader I.C.E sourcebook context. While the Shadow World Master Atlas was published in early 1989, somewhat retconning earlier I.C.E books in a series called The World of Loremaster. Loremaster and Rolemaster are anagrams. The spelling's just a little shuffled. The first of these was The Iron Wind in 1980, which had another edition a few years later. This is where you see the original form of the goddess we call Oleni. In a real-world, out-of-game sense, she's the oldest of the gods. Then with the books around 1984, you have Empress Kadaena, spelled without that A.E. ligature, and the Lords of Essence, also without the ligature. This is the source of the stuff I've been calling vestigial I.C.E text about the Lords of Essence. Uther was still in those older books, but Andrax was not. In the Vogmer book, we have Lords of Essence creating demons artificially, and in the Cloud Lords of Tanara, we have some of our Liabo gods, though before they were associated with the Moon Orhan. Some of their names in those books were retconned in the 1989 Shadow World books. Such and such culture calls this deity by this other name and imagines them this other way. Similarly, as you'll see, a couple of our Lornon gods did exist in 1989. They just were not associated with a pantheon on that moon yet. Various details are slightly different in the older I.C.E books, and they were not always shoehorned in cleanly. In this excerpt from the 1984 version of the Iron Wind, the Loremasters appear near the end of the Second Era, whereas in Shadow World, the Second Era begins with the Loremasters after a long interregnum. So, in Shadow World, the Loremasters are elves, and Andrax, a Lord of Essence pretending to be elven. In the earlier books, the Loremasters have mysterious origins and might be descended from the Lords of Essence. Though the immortal First Lords must all be dead, there were other, still mortal Lords of Essence. Then it was the surviving followers of Kadaena who became the first servants of the Unlife, and they created the first of the great demons, a phrase repeated in the Wars of Dominion. The Lords of Orhan, meanwhile, do not exist yet in those books. Unlife and Wars of Dominion go back to the Iron Wind in 1980, but the context for it does not really translate. So you can start to see why that brief whirlwind history section in the 1989 adventure modules is so messed up. It's using an outdated chronology for the Second Age, has surviving lesser Lords of Essence who make demons artificially, and is forced together with the newer Lords of Orhan concept. Meanwhile, the Loremasters versus the Unlife cults, risen from the surviving followers of Kadaena, is like a reprisal of the Kadaena versus Uther civil war. But the Servants of the Shadow phrase is only used in the Whirlwind history section from the 1989 adventure modules. So the creators of the Graveyard story were using that, and may even have not known any of what I just said. The great demons are probably Ordainers. Ordainers back to the 1980 version of the Iron Wind. These are fallen demigods who serve the Unlife now. The I.C.E demonology category scheme changed over time, and what's worse, the Shadow World setting retcons it and recategorizes the same things. But the creators of the Graveyard used the Creatures and Treasures books, including Creatures and Treasures 1 from 1985, before the proper Shadow World setting, and some of those creatures are not in the Inhabitants Guide from 1989. There's an anomaly. A few of the creatures are in its index, but are not in my ebook of it, and I doubt they're in the Inhabitants Guide in practice. In any case, the issue is that if they are using those old monster manuals, there's cosmological stuff about the demonic that could be relevant to Gemstone, even though it would be off-canon for Shadow World. Most especially since the Graveyard leans on a passage that has demons being fashioned, quote-unquote. The I.C.E books had two fundamental categories of demons, Demons of the Void and Demons of the Pale. In those 1984 books, the Demons of the Pale are made artificially by the Lords of Essence, scaled in classes from 1 to 6, with 1 being the most powerful. Creatures and Treasures flips this on its head. Class 1 is the weakest, Class 6 is the highest, or really beyond Class 6, beyond the Pale. Demons of the Pale are tormented, but seem fundamentally extraplanar. Demons of the Void are more like what we would call extraplanar undead. They originate in the souls of mannish, elven, and immortal evildoers. This is important because it allows the possibility of everlasting existence by being transformed into the demonic. At the highest end are fallen demigods. Kadaena's flame souls were retconned from the lesser of these. In the Emer book from 1990, Kadaena also had an Ordainer as a bodyguard. But were one to extrapolate into that 1980s demon classification, it would be logical for fallen Lords of Essence to become, after death, powerful demons of the Void. Empress Kadaena's soul should have been trapped in a necklace she wore called the Shadow Stone, and then destroyed when another Essence Lord named Ondeval wore it. But the Shadow Stone does not appear until the 1990 books, so we get to conveniently ignore that issue too. It's entirely plausible then, in an off-canon sense, for our Empress Kadaena in GemStone to still exist, and to be related to Demons of the Void, as some foul alternative to I.C.E.'s Oblivion. Shadow World jumbles this all up. It has Demons of the Essence, which are related to Chaos and the Unlife, the negative or anti-essence planes of existence, and the Void is outside existence. But there are planes of near void, which are the 6 pales. The outer void is utterly foreign and alien. Shadow World is inconsistent on whether the void is related to the Unlife or unrelated to it. Meanwhile, when the Dark Gods of Charon are introduced in the Master Atlas Addendum from 1990, they are defined as originating in the Chaos planes and are chaotic manifestations of the anti-essence, which makes them indirectly related to the Unlife. But then the same book says in another spot that they are related to the Demons of the Pale, that they have portals leading there and send the souls of their followers to the Pales. So it's nice and convoluted and inconsistent for us, but we can ignore 1990 onward for the graveyard, for the most part. One exception to that is the Upper Coastal Cliffs area that was released in 1991. You may recall in the previous episode that I think this area is a spin-off of the Graveyard story, that the underground stronghold was one of the cults Banner crushed to found his theocracy. That it was a cult of Chlysis, who we call Lukos, could perhaps be considered another wrong thing, in the sense that the Dark Path theocracy seems antagonistic or antithetical to I.C.E., and Chlysis was the arch-enemy of I.C.E. because he is a god of death and a soul-eater. While Chlysis' physical incarnation is necromancer by profession, there is very little emphasis on death with Chlysis. In fact, in much later Shadow World books, he's not even the patron of undeath and necromancy. That's a dark spirit by the name of Bogolith, who resembles a rotting corpse. Their beef is over destroying souls, which in I.C.E.'s original description is the worst possible fate. That is her description in 1989, before Vault. Vault, the releaser and cleanser of souls, first appears in 1990. Chlysis was also tight with Lorgalis, who in the Emer book from 1990 uses Chlysis' influence to gain control over the sarcophagus of Kadaena's headless body. But I will talk more about Lorgalis later in this video. I'm just mentioning that up front. So if you read through the rooms of the underground stronghold that existed in 1991, it is fairly clear that the area looks weirdly unlived in. And then it has a secret wing with an altar with ancient Chlysis text involving bloody sacrifices, because that was his thing. He was into bloody sacrifices, not really so much on death. The fall of Kelburn was only 210 years ago. It's not long enough to qualify as ancient. What links this more strongly to the graveyard? First, if you look outside the stronghold, it draws from the same dangerous plants material used in the graveyard. There's Delphinurus moss, which causes amnesia, and dream vines, which are carnivorous. These words were overlooked in the de-ice. Delphinurus got retconned into a peace symbol flower, while dream vines got restored in the Red Forest release. Then, if you move further into the cemetery, you see two striking things. First, there's a mausoleum with friezes and an empty sarcophagus, much like the crypt in the graveyard. Then on the other side, there is a monument depicting a black sea dragon. This imagery is also used in the burial mound in the graveyard, with Kestrel's coffin and his battle throne. So that's a pretty strong link. When you go back over to the underground stronghold, something extraordinarily violent happened to that cult. On the eastern side, there is a pile of bodies blasted there with extreme force. Then in the middle, there is a guard who has been flattened, like completely flattened with extreme strength. That ain't the work of Kral, what we call Krobin. You go inside that chamber, assuming you do not fall into the pit trap, and the ladies' bedroom is untouched. But the other bed chamber has a totally dismembered body whose head has gone for a walk. That head is stuffed in a tree further up the way on the coastal cliffs. So, what happened here? First, this stronghold originally only had what we call dark visions, which are very weak. They were called dark wisplings. The dark wisplings didn't do it. Wisplings are what we would call wordlings. They're the weakest kind of elemental. They're here in this plane artificially. In the Elemental Companion from 1989, which defines them, elemental darkness is associated with cold criticals. In the Atlantean setting, darkness is not an element, but in the Elemental Companion it is. And the Grail, which became Urglace, is the metal of elemental darkness. It gives an innate defensive bonus because it obscures the wielder. Regardless, elementals attack by trying to pound the target, so the dark wisplings pound and thus inflict cold criticals. So much for that. And I would be remiss in not pointing out that the West Wing says welcome to Gemstone, backwards. Everything is backwards, you see, even our OOC Easter eggs. But if the Wisplings and the Kral did not do this, what happened to these people? Well, Bander crushed the pockets of resistance with creatures of his own creation, which at least accounts for the Wisplings. The circumstantial evidence suggests this extreme violence was done by demons of the Pale. Specifically, demons of the Fifth Pale are so strong they can punch through stone walls, or steel doors as the case may be. And demons of the Sixth Pale are wildly violent acrobats who gouge their claws in the stone and swoop down, decapitating their victims in one fell motion. The decapitation in any case is consistent with Bender's theocracy because of Empress Kadaena, and Clysis would be a rival death god. But if this was done by demons of the Pale, and the story is saying Bander created the forces he used to do this slaughter, then the evidence would be implying he was creating such demons artificially. This would be totally off-canon for Shadow World, but it is consistent with that Whirlwind History section in the 1989 Adventure modules, and totally consistent with the books from the mid-1980s. The Unlife itself began in the 80s as a sourceless force that feeds on death and destruction, needing to consume ever more, and waiting for tools that allow it to act. It is treated as having a will to destruction. In the Shadow World setting in 1989, it becomes associated with anti-essence, a corrupting form of magical energy. Then in the cosmology from 1990 onward, it is the most chaotic extreme of the essence spectrum, the heart of chaos, and it becomes something that has no self-awareness or intent, not something with will. The servants of the Unlife at that point are nihilistic madmen, and the other evil factions sort of regard them as terrorists and crazy extremists, only interested in annihilating things, whereas the others want to dominate and control things. But in 1989, the context when the Graveyard was written, the Unlife was still the big bad, and Empress Kadaena is framed as the leader along with her surviving followers, because of this vestigial stuff from those older Ice books. Now would be a good time to take a detour and consider some hypothetical cases of things in Shadow World books that might have influenced the design of the graveyard. There's an Egyptian-themed kingdom called Gethyra in the Kingdom of the Desert Jewel adventure module from 1989, which is located next to the Bay of Thrak on the continent Thule, far to the west of Jaimon and on the opposite side of Thule as Isle, from the Journey to the Magic Isle book from 1989. Isle was being worked on at one point by former GMs Kygar and Fawn, and that ended up being reworked into Terrace Isle after the de-ice when GemStone moved to AOL. Whether Terrace is supposed to play on Magic Isle by using the ancient Greek meanings of the word terrace, I do not know. It would probably depend on who renamed it Terrace Isle. It could just as easily be coincidence. So, in the Kingdom of Gethyra, there is a mummy king, and there is a palace with a great hall, and this great hall has columns of Aranyark, which absorbs the background essence, which means casters of Essence Realm spells operate at a 90% penalty. That's pretty much the sum total of possibly relevant elements from the Kingdom of the Desert Jewel sourcebook. Nothing else really jumps out at me, but it's worth mentioning because it is at least conceivable this influenced the Graveyard Crypt, which is inlaid with Aranyark, and of course has lesser mummies, a sarcophagus, and so on, and a false door involving the word Thrak. More interesting is the case of the Isle of Aranmore in southwest Jaimon. It is surrounded by a boiling sea called the Sea of Fire. The second episode I spoke of the scimitar that has a demon trapped in it, and speaks to the wielder about Malaskari, an Ordainer who is the demon lord of death and undeath. The newsletters, assuming they were not player embellishments of the auction, say the sword was found on the land directly across from Aranmore, Placidar. The reason for this is that the Nereti culture on Aranmore would embed demons in weapons and other objects. These are a special class of demons who are created as servants by the dead gods of the Black Hell. Supposedly it is a Slayer demon that is in the Dark Sawtooth Scimitar, though that is very weird, because Slayer demons are supposed to be fairly mindless killers, and Ordainers are unrelated to Black Hell demons. It would make more sense if the demon was an invoker, a more intelligent demigod-level demon of the Slayer or even Riddler types. Riddler demons are notorious for telling lies. But anyway, that is merely to say that later in the Ice Age, there was GM attention to the Isle of Aranmore as part of the world setting. The Isle of Aranmore is covered in the Demons of the Burning Night adventure module from 1989, and it is far more interesting than the Kingdom of the Desert Jewel. Aranmore was ruled by a theocracy of the Black Hell gods. These were a pantheon of what is later called Dark Godlings and Spirit Servants. It is ruled by Orgiana, the goddess we now know as Irgina, before she was included in the pantheon we now call Lornon. The principal author of Shadow World, Terry Amthor, essentially said in a forum post several years ago that Orgiana was included with the Corone gods as basically an afterthought. Orgiana, unlike Irgina, was not the ruler of the Dark Lords of Corone. She was one of the weakest. But in the Demons of the Burning Night book, she did rule over her own pantheon of dark gods. What was most fascinating about this is that the ruler of her theocracy was Varama Ver, the surviving mortal daughter of Empress Kadaena herself. And this was in the Second Era, from around the year 2000 up through some point in the Wars of Dominion, which means the late stages of this theocracy were contemporary with Bender Etrivion, whose theocracy of Kadaena was on the northwest side of the same continent. Kadeena's daughter and her father, Iogun, who was a scientist and one of Kadeena's slaves, were cryogenically preserved until they awoke in the Second Era. Iogun kidnapped the infant daughter because he discerned the daughter was not immortal and expected Kadaena would kill her. Kadeena's Shadowstone necklace, incidentally, was made using her infant daughter's blood and a whole lot of souls. but that was established in later books. In the Demons of the Burning Night book, Eogan wanted to invent a way to turn himself and Kadena's mortal daughter into gods, which is interesting because Shadowworld, unlike Atlantia, has almost no examples of the ascension concept. What we started calling the lesser spirits in the late 90s were originally the great spirits of Orhan and the dark spirits of Karon. And these were entities akin in nature to the deities of those moons. Without going into that in too much detail, the one exception in the 1990 books was Leia, who was a demigod, the daughter of Kay, who we call Kai. Most demigods in Shadowworld are nothing special. There are lots of illegitimate offspring with the Lords of Orhan. On occasion, a demigod will have inherited greater powers, and if they are unable to handle existing on such scales, they have to be destroyed, which is regarded as a great tragedy. Leia was the only listed example of a demigod who the Lords of Orhan had allowed to fully ascend, if you want to use that word. In Atlantia, most of the lesser gods were supposedly once mortals ascended in various ways, but it's not like that in Shadowworld. There's just a narrow loophole for demigods. So it really stands out that there's a kind of ascension goal for Eogan and Kadena's daughter, Varamer, if this book was used, particularly since we're poking around this notion of Kadena somehow being or becoming a goddess. So pretty much everything about the Isle of Arranmore and the Black Hell is awesome. I can't even begin to do it justice here. Most of it, of course, is not relevant. What is most interesting to us is an artifact called the Helm of Kadaena, which would be like a 10x OB helmet that provides its bonus passively to spell attacks along with other powers. It would call out to others in their dreams and led to rumors that Empress Kadaena was resurrected on Arranmore, plotting to take her revenge on Kolthia. One of the only ways to destroy it was to throw it into the Mount Kadaena volcano. Very Lord of the Rings. There were a number of things obviously taken from Tolkien, but the artifact was the sort of thing Bandar would have attempted to acquire, and it never says whether Kadaena was wearing it when she was decapitated. Based on later books, probably not, but in the 1989 context, who knows? The reason this interests us is because the Helm of Kadaena was historically stored in two places. One is a crypt with a fake sarcophagus of Kadaena, next to a portal to the Black Hell, where you were imprisoned and enslaved by Orgiana. The other is in the Temple of Burning Night, which was Orgiana's temple in the Theocracy. Both of these locations make decently strong candidates for being a design basis or inspiration for the crypt in the graveyard. First, let's consider the Crypt of Kadaena because it is less involved. Recall that Andrax has a fake sarcophagus on the Watching Isle, a secret island just south of the Library of Namikos. There's a hologram of him in it, keeping up the illusion. This sarcophagus of Empress Kadaena is empty. There are grand crypts of other queens and Kadaena, fleshing out a fake royal dynasty for Varamer. There's a secret chamber in the sarcophagus where the Helm of Kadaena was stored before the fall of the Theocracy. Empress Kadaena, as I said, has a real sarcophagus with her headless body in it near the South Pole, though that wasn't the Emer book in 1990. So this, by itself, is a point of interest, because the crypt has a fake sarcophagus of Bandar. Kestrel's coffin is probably fake, too. I would bet that Kestrel is actually the melted throne of human ivory in the underground throne room. That was a black channels rather than absolution pure spell, and Bandar liquefied his skeleton with it. Or maybe inflicted the Kadeena's kiss curse, which melts away the flesh and annihilates the soul. Anyway, beyond the mere fact of the fake sarcophagus, there is the poem on it, which refers to Kadaena as a sleeping queen. It is mildly conflating her with Orgiana, as this room has a portal to the Black Hell behind 6 locks. There are a number of subtle conflations of Orgiana and Kadaena in this book. which will be relevant again if I do one of these historical series on the Broken Lands, as Kygar handled those two in a very off-canon way in the Dark Shrine. In the graveyard context, this gateway could perhaps be reinterpreted as a dark parallel keys to the Gates of Oblivion, though I would not suggest that is intentional. That is mixing together stuff not written by Simultronics. So let's back up for a minute and look at the theocracy of the Black Hell. It is Hell with one L, like the Norse death goddess. Orgiana is pretty blatantly inspired by Hell, but inverted, made fire themed instead of hold. When Kadaena's daughter was seeking power, she called out to the powers of darkness, and for whatever unknown reasons, Orgiana agreed to help her. So she became the ruler of a theocracy for Orgiana's pantheon, who resided in a demonic outer plane called the Black Hell. The Black Hell gods make their own demons out of warped spirits to act as servants. They are unrelated to the demons of the Pale or the Void. The most powerful of them, Invokers, are thought to be demigodal offspring of the Black Hell gods. There are 7 wards, each having its own role, serving a category of function. Weirdly, the capital city of Tarak Nev is surrounded by a 100,000-year-old protector demon that is bound in place as a wall, who dramatically slows down time within the city. So you have some ambiguities about how Empress Kadaena is related to the Black Hell pantheon far back in antiquity, as this island was one of her strongholds in the First Era. There are a number of things on the island dating back to the time of Empress Kadaena, including these warped monsters with the faces of weeping children. Kadaena enjoyed making warped travesties of life as well as artificial constructs, her attempts at creating unnatural life that could reproduce themselves. That is how the Gagor, what we call Vrul, originated. They were made by the Empress Kadaena. So Empress Kadaena's mortal daughter, Varama Ver, was doing her theocracy thing for several thousand years inside a city with vastly sloped time. Wars of Dominion happened, the Nereti were invading off their island, and this rankled the Lords of Orhan. The Lords of Orhan allow local gods to rule their own domains, but there are ancient balances of power, and these theocracy people were stepping out of bounds. So the Lords of Orhan issue a summons, demanding the Black Hell gods appear before a conclave. The Black Hell gods impolitely refused. This soon leads to the Lords of Orhan coming down hard on them, killing some of them, banishing others. Iraq imprisoned some in meteoric Eog, which is now called Aura. Orgiana herself is thought to have fled to the moon Couronne, now called Lornon, which was before there was a pantheon defined for that moon. But one way or another, she was really banished to the Black Hell and is trapped there, unable to return, for now. In the 1990 books, the Dark Lords of Couronne were running amok, and it was a few hundred years before the Lords of Orhan intervened. It took a long time for them to all agree to put a stop to the Wars of Dominion. In the Master Atlas Addendum from 1990, it happens at the Battle of Migris, where Kay, who we call Kai, saves Andrax from Skalu, who we call Sharu. Interestingly, Skalu's heralds were there leading legions of demons, what we would call Cherubian harbingers. But that battle is dated for the very end of the Wars of Dominion. In later Shadow World books, the Lords of Orhan begin intervening several decades earlier than that, clearing the smoke and ash from the sky. Demons of the Burning Night uses the year 6200 Second Era, which is wrong, so we just have to assume it was later on in the wars. Perhaps it was the incident that pissed off the Lords of Orhan enough to finally intervene and stop it all. So, with her gods gone, Varama Ver is isolated, and then her people cause more trouble. Then the Loremasters and some angelic-like forces smite the island. The Black Hell gods are now known as the Dead Gods of Aranmore, being dead, banished, or imprisoned. Like the Viking goddess Hel, Orgiana is banished to a kind of underworld. Most of the Shadow World gods are very similar to their de-iced versions in Atlantia. They're just about 20% cooler. They tend to have the same qualities, but put through a funhouse mirror, blowing some stuff up and shrinking other stuff down. Orgiana is fairly different from Eugenia. She has none of that Queen of the Gods, evil stepmother stuff. And to the extent that the Queen of the Gods thing comes from Shadowworld, it would have to come from the Demons of the Burning Night book, not the Master Atlas Addendum, which doesn't mention that. From 1990 onward, Orgiana's cults are man-haters because she has an intense hatred of men. This may have fed into the Evis Eugenia lovers thing I mentioned in episode 2, but that wasn't in the 1989 version of Orgiana. Orgiana was the ruler of the Black Hell Pantheon. She was cruel and fiery, literally. Her skin was essentially steel, and she was literally burning. It was never stated if the Black Hell Pantheon was a sub-pantheon of the Dark Lords of Charon, which would have to be a retcon since that was invented later. But with the Orhan and Charon pantheons, there are more deities than the ones we're familiar with. It is stated that there are others. Since Orgiana was made part of the Charon pantheon, and that must have been in the Second Era, which was during her theocracy, it is safe to say these Black Hell gods fit that category. Either way, Orgiana and the Black Hell raises an interesting question, especially in light of Empress Kadaena's daughter. In the Graveyard story, Kadaena is framed as a Lord of Orhan who followed the Unlife, and then there were others. One possibility would be Kadaena became some sort of demonic goddess of the void. If the Demons of the Burning Night book was used, on the other hand, could it more specifically be the case that Empress Kadaena became Orgiana? All we can do is look to see if there are more examples linking the Graveyard to material in that source book. So that brings us to the Temple of Burning Night, which is the Temple of Orgiana. This is the place the helm of Kadaena was brought by her high priests when the theocracy was falling and the warrior wearing it was struck down. It is locked under a big heart stone below the central worship chamber underneath a statue of Orgiana. The first thing we notice is that the temple exterior has horrific decorations, as does the exterior and interior of the crypt and the graveyard. That is perhaps too generic to count. Something more specific are the jutting black spikes and the vertical iron rods surrounding the statue of Orgiana. This is a tropical environment after thousands of years. These would be rusted red, implicitly making her look wreathed in flames, like the vertical iron spikes on the graveyard gate. The statue says, "Offend not, Orgiana, lest thou give up thy soul." For what it is worth, thy soul is a phrase used in GemStone's death mechanics. Above that, notice that in Chapel 4, when people speak, their voices are not heard. This is what happens in the false door room of the crypt when the invoking phrase of the portal is spoken. Moving deeper into Orgiana's temple, there are a series of hidden rooms. Once you get past the Chamber of Lies with the cursed chalice that never gets stolen, because it always returns, you find something quite striking. A scroll room. There is a niche 7 feet above the floor, like in the graveyard crypt, which opens the way to show you a parchment sealed in wax. This scroll is addressed to Orgiana and bears her skull symbol, which is interesting in itself. But Orgiana's symbol in the theocracy is the helm of Kadaena. So we have a niche near the ceiling, parchments in sealing wax, and a direct analog to an insignia of Kadaena. Then there is a stone false door leading into a relic room, as there is in the crypt, though in the crypt it's empty, which then leads down a narrow tunnel as it does in the crypt. This ultimately leads to the Heartstone, which is holding the Helm of Kadaena artifact. The inscription on it says, "By coward Utha, cruelly slain, she sleeps who spurns death, and awaits the hero shining clad." The last line is about the puzzle for opening it. But again, Kadaena is framed as a sleeping queen who spurns death. Now look back at the crypt in the graveyard, in homage to that which defies death itself. Combined with the false sarcophagus of Kadaena in granite crypts in Voromavir's palace, we have a reasonably strong candidate for what the crypt in the graveyard might have been modeled on within the Shadow World context, though Bandar would, I think, have been familiar with it through his nightmare omens, as he would not likely have been allowed in these places, and is likely anachronistic for him. I would not say this rises to the level of proof because of the lack of exact quotes and so on. It is certainly not a ridiculous theory. Even if it is wrong, it is very plausible for many reasons. It is not something we can easily dismiss. It might very well have been based on Orgiana's Temple of Burning Night. Either way, Kadaena as a dead goddess is the simplest way of interpreting the story, but it is not the only way. Another way of resolving the anachronism of Kadaena and the Wars of Dominion is to assume there is bridging across time. There are two senses of this. The first is time travel, the other is information across time. Both of these have legs in the Shadow World setting. The most powerful Lord of Essence gateways are able to send you into the future or the past. Ondeval, for example, does this to recover Kadaena's Shadowstone amulet from right after she was killed. Though Empress Kadaena dies in the First Era and was presumably not present as herself in the Wars of Dominion. With information across time, there is the magical sense of prophecy and seers. We are biased because in the Atlantean world setting, Gasina is a prophecy goddess with the ability to know when everything will die. There is nothing anywhere in the Ice books suggesting Empress Kadaena had prophetic powers, but her cousin Andrax is a seer by profession, so he has spell lists that allow for visions into other times. The introduction section of the Shadow World Master Atlas includes a vision he has of the Unlife and the sun getting blacked out. So the idea might be that Kadaena could have been directing future events from the far past, being able to see future events. She could leave commands for her followers in artifacts, like the speaking crystal Bandar tried to steal. This would involve some weirdness, as she would have known her own death in advance, but who knows. More exotic still, you could lean into the Space Master material for the Gethyra race, that is, the Lords of Essence and their innate abilities. While in the vicinity of Calthea they can do magic, having access to the Essence, that does not work when you leave Calthea. They were never able to establish portals to other parts of the galaxy. The Essence is bleeding into this universe from other planes of existence through an interdimensional rift that's right next to Calthea. From 1990 onward, this is because of a cataclysm a couple 100,000 years ago when the Lords of Orhan got stuck in this plane from a higher plane. But the Gethyra also had innate psionic powers, unlike mentalism, which is magic powered by the Essence. These could include stuff like telepathy, telekinetics, and so on. Heretic, when properly spoken, is a partly telepathic language. Among these innate psionic powers can include the ability to see the very distant future, including specifically knowledge of when things will become dead. It will also allow transference, the ability to essentially possess someone else in the future from the past, and we see Bandar get possessed in the story. Bandar also has ominous omens, which if taken literally suggest some capacity for seeing other times or places, which is why I highlighted the modern and ancient language coexisting in the graveyard in episode 2. Following this kind of thread allows explanations for how Bandar had unnatural knowledge of things the Loremasters did not know. It's a very Lovecraftian notion, like the Great Race of Yith and the narcotic manuscripts from the Shadow Out of Time, which is something I'll bring up again in the Death episode. This seems more far-fetched and less likely to be the intent than the dead goddess approach, which as you will see is reinforced by the allegorical interpretation, but it is something worth considering. Let's switch gears and look at Kestrel Etrivion. Bander's older brother, who Bander usurped to found his Dark Path theocracy. Bander masterminded the rise of Kestrel up the ranks of the warriors of the Unlife. This presumably means manipulating victories and perhaps murdering rivals. Kestrel might not have been aware of that help. Who knows? So, there was a particularly hard-fought campaign that was doomed to almost certain defeat, were it not for Bander's sorceress intervention. This might mean something along the lines of the Amulet of Summoning from later in the story, but that would help in a battle. This says campaign. What Bander did to help may have been more complicated. Regardless, as a result of this victory, Kestrel was rewarded with a small fiefdom, part of the land that forms the windward edge of the high plateau. This raises some obvious questions. Who was Kestrel fighting, having barely won? And who was Kestrel's liege lord or master? Is the fiefdom, after all, not a sovereign kingdom? It was given to him to rule over by someone higher up. There are two obvious possibilities, and I will start with the less likely option. In the burial mound in the cemetery on the coastal cliffs, there is iconography of a black sea drake. This could represent the dragon lord Ulia Shek, who is a black sea dragon. The dragon lords were conquerors during the Wars of Dominion. Her base is an island west of the continent Thule, near the Wall of Darkness, not terribly far, relatively speaking, from the kingdom of Gethyra. This would be pretty random, and I do not think it was her. The strongest case would be Lorgalis the White, who in some respects is fairly obviously inspired by Saruman from Lord of the Rings. Lorgalis is half Lord of Essence. His father was one of Kadaena's servants, and his mother was Diari, that is, Dark Elven. Dark Elves in Shadowworld are an evil cultural offshoot of the Eilari, specifically branched off from the Loari, the Builders. They're not literally dark like the Drow from Forgotten Realms. They're just evil jerks. Often they worship dark gods, especially who we call Evis and Mularos. Some people in the Ice Age played their characters as Diari, and some of those founded the Dinar after the De-Ice, which were eventually canonized about half a decade later. The High Elf race in Gemstone was initially going to be changed to gnomes, but through some pushback, lobbying, or whatever, we got Dark Elves instead, at least until GemStone IV, when we got two races of gnomes. Payback is a... Digression aside, Lorgalis was born early in the Second Era in books from 1990 onward, but in 1989 it is held as more likely that he was born in the First Era before Kadaena and Utha started fighting, which would make him one of those surviving followers of Empress Kadaena who turned to the Unlife for power. Again, from 1990 onward, he reluctantly cooperates with forces of the Unlife in the Wars of Dominion, not being an Unlife fanatic himself. In the 1989 books, he is called a servant of the Unlife, the most powerful servant of the Unlife on the whole continent. Lorgalis is driven by revenge, as Andrax killed his father early in the Second Era, and he focuses on conquering Jaimon, because Jaimon is Andrax's favorite continent. In the 1989 books, Lorgalis is much in bed with the Iron Winds, doing as they do, putting on false personas to infiltrate kingdoms as learned wise men, then bringing those kingdoms down from within, destroying them. The difference is Lorgalis does it for conquest. Lorgalis is intrinsically more powerful than the Eilari high priests of the Iron Wind cults, so he has essentially direct control over one of them, the Order of Yorthrak, which is also known as the Cult of the Sea Drake. Voila! The Black Sea Drake imagery is thus explained by the Lorgalis theory as well. Lorgalis is the most important person you have never heard of. He was trying to conquer Jaimon in the Second Era, and later books have him fleeing Jasek, who we call Justev, at the end of the Wars of Dominion, and he was presumed dead, but then he comes back and is still trying to conquer Jaimon in the Third Era. In the present of 6050 Third Era, Lorgalis controls the whole peninsula that is immediately west of Kelborn, where you would end up if you kept following the coastal cliffs farther west. This peninsula does not exist in the Atlantean world setting. In Shadowworld, it is known as Xar, spelled with an X. Lorgalis controls the Bay of Ulor, essentially the western coast of Jaimon. He and the cult of the Sea Drake also control Unlife in 6050 Third Era. Lorgalis also controlled Unlife and Xar at the start of the Wars of Dominion in the Second Era, which means he was the one who controlled access in and out of Cladesburn Bay. In fact, he had controlled Xar for 2,000 years at that point. What Lorgalis did not control, then or now, was the country in between Cladesburn Bay and Unlife. In the Second Era, this was the Kingdom of Soralis. Today, it's multiple factions. The largest is a petty rulership called Soral. The Soral March is the northern mountain range of Soralis, and the Kaldsfang Mountains are essentially just part of the Soral March, near Cladesburn Bay. Jaimon has three major mountain ranges: the Soral March in the northwest, the Black Fork in the northeast of Jamal Targ, and the Grey Mountains along the east coast. The Grantok dwarves who worked on what we call Melgren's Reach were from the Grey Mountains, near the Kingdom of Verkan in southeast Zor. That might be what the dwarven rune letters on the Reach are referencing, SE and ZOR. But with respect to the Soral March, it would be logical for Kestrel to have been attempting to invade northern Soralis for Lorgalis during the Wars of Dominion, especially the early part of the Wars of Dominion. In later Shadowworld books, Lorgalis crushes the Kingdom of Soralis using an Ordainer named Karuk. But in the 1989 books, Soralis is brought down by sorcerer sages through seduction of treachery. This could be what Bander's sorcerer's intervention in Kestrel's campaign really means. He might have been infiltrating like the Ironwind cults do. In the Wars of Dominion, Lorgalis had sent his fleet to the eastern regions of Jaimon, where the Etrivions are from, and the same phrase used in the story. It isn't obvious which part the Etrivions come from, though not Eurolon, which was Elven lands. Possibly near the edge of Zor, the Zor royalty buried their dead in sarcophagi. So, long story short, it is quite plausible that they joined Lorgalis' fleet, associated with the cult of the Sea Drake, and then Bander would have some connection to a surviving servant of Kadaena, so-called Servants of the Shadow, perhaps having a plausible reason to know of the Lords of Essence, though Lorgalis would not have given him the time of day, and he likely would have learned of Empress Kadaena's daughter to the south at some point. If you were to actually follow this world logic through, it raises questions, like would Lorgalis have had a problem with the theocracy and usurpation? Kestrel's sons probably tried to take back control of the kingdom, but they clearly lost and were killed. They're not even mentioned in the story. Bander buried them next to the crypt. In the Second Era, the Manish kingdoms were protected by powerful artifacts called the Six Crowns that were made by an Ilari smith named Tethior. These were powerful enough to thwart Lorgalis from conquering kingdoms. So he would put on his false persona, the magician, and try to become an advisor to kings, advising them to wear their crowns less, which they didn't like wearing because to some extent the crowns limited and controlled their thoughts, keeping the kings from warring with each other. The Wyvern crown of Soralis could naturally explain why Kestrel's campaign was facing hopeless defeat. The Soral March might also explain the phrase Northern Marches at the end of the story. It could just be an everything is backwards inversion. But Kestrel did not control the whole of Cladesburn Bay. He would raid the other coastal settlements, so some of them to the north may have been striking back. Depending on how far north his fiefdom ran, it might have been close to what became the Citadel of Kelburn. So it is possible that the Etrivion story is interfacing with the early Kelburn story. The Broken Land story is most likely a spin-off of the Graveyard story. Uthex was based just north of this in the Sealfar Strait in the same time period. In fact, Uthex was killed in 6521 Second Era, The same year, Lorgalis conquered Xorus with his Ordainer, which destroyed the Wyvern Crown. Frustratingly, I cannot find that in an early enough book. It could just be a bizarre coincidence. However it went down precisely, the theocracy would not have survived the Wars of Dominion. The Council of Light is only related to the Shadow World materials by about an inch deep. They're almost certainly not the Dark Path. For the past 2,000 years of the Third Era, the Iron Wind has controlled Lunak, the Blue Forest of northern Jaimon. They destroyed it by waking up demonic artificial constructs that had been made by Kadaena, called shards. Shards are the coolest thing you have never heard of. They existed in GemStone at one point. The Blue Forest reaches all the way up to Cladesburn Bay, so it overlaps the Kelborn map in some ill-defined way. The Lunarni trees are 500 feet tall. Now, you might be saying, shut up, there aren't 500-foot trees in the landing region. There are actually near what we call Zeltov. So, brief aside on the shards, since I can't out myself. There's later Shadow World material called the Grand Campaign, and in the Grand Campaign materials it is specified that when you're about 30 miles from the coast of Cladesburn Bay, the Blue Forest, and these Lunarni trees, the blue spires, are huge blue-leafed spruce trees. The Blue Forest gives way to a dark forest, the Black Forest of Deer. Deer is what we call the wood fell. The wood is black, similar to ebony, and the leaves are dark green, kind of oily. We have a forest like that near Zeltov in Atlantia called the Deadfall, but that's a total coincidence. So, the Forest of Deer is a very evil forest. It is extremely dangerous, aside from a hidden temple of Jasek, who we call Justev. The Forest of Deer is where the shards reside. It is first mentioned in the Master Atlas Addendum in 1990. Before that, the shards are only associated vaguely with the northwest Blue Forest, where the Iron Wind woke them up and used them to destroy a Manish kingdom there in 4166 Third Era, and they ate the brain and bowels of the conqueror Ugus Faust, who first appeared in the older Iron Wind book, which doesn't mention this happening. Since the Colossus was probably made in the Ice Age, it might maybe be a representation of Ugus Faust. That requires a couple of layers of speculation, but it's plausible. The story was in the Tombs of Kulthea, an excerpt from the Master Atlas. So, the Grand Campaign material makes it clear that the Forest of Deer runs up to the north side of the ruins of the Kelburn Citadel. So it is up in the Sealfar Strake part of the map, but that wasn't defined yet in the Ice Age of GemStone. The shards used to be in the forest outside the Spider Temple in GemStone at one point, and they had poisonous tails, I think. Poison in any case. In the Broken Lands there is Fellwood, what would have said Deerwood originally, and that is almost certainly because of the Forest of Deer. It's the only context for deer trees existing on this continent. Otherwise, they're in the Emer book. The monastery with the liches also refers to a rare black Windak wood. Windak is really just the Sealtang word for local pine trees. Digression aside, the shards are made from men or elves and demons. They're fast-moving artificial constructs who use trees to sense for them. They use poison and they have a taste for devouring brains. It might be why there's a decapitated bear in Dangerland. They were not used to slaughter the Blue Forest until the Third Era, but they're constructs of Kadaena right next to her theocracy. The Elven Village and Red Forest and GemStone were slightly later after the Ice Age, roughly February 1996. I think it had been a running ongoing thing about when there will be an Elven Village in the game. It was presumably inspired by the slaughter of the Blue Forest in Shadow World, though I don't know for sure. Red Forest is right where the hills would be giving way to the Blue Forest in Shadow World. But back to the Iron Wind. In the Jaimon book, it is clarified that one of the Iron Wind cults, the High Priest of the Order of Athamerl, was responsible for destroying Kelburn. That is, they were the ones who corrupted the sorcerer Xenon, who destroyed Kelburn from within 200 years ago. The Iron Wind in 1980 has various powers serving it. the Dragon Lord Orangetar, who does so willingly, as well as Ordainers. The least of its minions are the priests Arnak and their messengers. By 1989, it is the priests Arnak that dominate the concept. The word Arnak never appears once in the Ice Age newsletters of Gemstone, even when they are being talked about. I suspect it might have been treated as a censored word. The priests Arnak pose as lovers of knowledge and seduce and corrupt local populations. The messengers are their violent enforcer branch. This is obviously the basic framework of the Council of Light. The Dragon Lord Orangetar controls the Order of Gath, the cult of the dragon, and holds great sway over the Order of Athamerl, the cult of the Snow Lion. Those two cults are based out of his fortress in Merfastisir, an island just northwest of Claysbrim Bay. The Torkons, what we call Roltons, actually pronounced Roltons. It was inspired by wonton soup. In the Shadowworld setting, they were imported to Kelborn from Merfastisir. There was a Gemstone-specific story document, Ditmar's Tale, where the Dragon Lord Orangetar was making an alliance with our local Krall warfarers, though I don't know much about anything that happened in-game related to that. Gath and Athamerl always work together. Gath does the northern coasts, Athamerl does the northern forests, generally speaking. So, on one level, this is obviously who is behind the Council of Light, but it also isn't. There's nothing about the Council of Light that suggests the Iron Wind is meaningfully relevant to it as a backstory. They are conspiring to move into Seralis, and so is Orangetar's brother, the Dragon Lord Sultan Nishang, who resides in the volcanic wasteland Jamil Targ, which is due east of the Sealfar Strait. Similarly, Lorgalis is seeking to invade Seralis. He and Sultan are great rivals. There's nothing in the Kelfor's editions to suggest the power struggle between these factions was ever actively developed in Gemstone, but I figured I would mention it because it's what ought to be true for the world setting. Though Lorgalis controls the Order of Yarthrak, Orangetar controls the Order of Goth, and Goth is trying to undermine Lorgalis and Zar in the Third Era. Leading up to the Wars of Dominion, the High Priest of Yarthrak tries to break free of Lorgalis, but was brought to heel. So it's all very treacherous, and in 1990 onward, it is specified Lorgalis does not have the sway he used to with the Iron Wind cults. The Iron Wind itself is some unspecified manifestation of the Unlife. They only care about destroying civilizations. They formed around 4000 Second Era. They were responsible for turning Zor into a nuclear wasteland prior to the Wars of Dominion, or at least most of Zor. And it was probably the Order of Dansart that was chasing the founders of Kelburn. So, long story short, Banner and Kestrel Atravion may have been adjacent to one of the Iron Wind cults, because of Kestrel most likely serving in the fleet of Lorgalis. And Lorgalis, as I said earlier, was tight with Clysis, as of 1990, which could mean something for the Coastal Cliffs underground stronghold from 1991, which was a cult of Clysis. Notably, what we call Leapers, originally called Bounders, are used as mounts by Dark Elves in Rolemaster, and as I said, Lorgalis was half Dark Elven. But if this deep background world logic was intended to interface with the Atravion story, it is very subtle, and it does not seem to matter much. The story is pretty much self-contained. Much of what I've been talking about is on the world map, but never physically existed in Gemstone itself. Some things in the landing region come straight out of the source books. The Spider Temple, for example, or what we call Cavernhold. Other things only ever exist in Gemstone. The Graveyard, the Reach, Shadow Valley, the Broken Lands. Darkstone Castle, originally called Claysbrim Castle, only exists in Gemstone. Having a big castle in this part of the map could potentially be relevant. There are plot hooks like Kestrel invading this region, or ruling here as a kingdom, or it could be one of the fortresses of Kelborn, though the creatures were undead or magical like golems. It's hard to reconcile that without someone like Bander creating them. Moreover, the castle would share monsters with the graveyard, but that could have just been a matter of expediency. I asked former GM Banthus once to what extent did they remodel Castle Claysbrim for the Estrion events. He said barely at all, and he was never able to find any information about what the original castle was about. I've never found anything in the ice books it might have been clearly adapted from, and Z-Path's older maps still largely work for navigating the castle. Virtually everything that looks cool or otherwise meaningful in the castle is related to the Estrion event, not the original castle. I do not see any hidden meaning in the original aspects of the castle. There's just nothing there to suggest it. I honestly think it was just a big dungeon with monsters in it. But who knows? Moving back to the graveyard, something I glossed over was all the modern writing, all of which is arguably wrong in some way. I would go so far as to say they are actually mocking Epitaphs, unrepentant, for someone supposedly consumed with guilt. Kestrel's sons are buried with, "Here lie the sons of Kestrel Etrivion, princes all, who perished in the battle to regain their ancestral land." This is, of course, nonsense. It was a recently acquired fiefdom. The Etrivions never controlled the lands of their ancestors. They probably tried to seize the fiefdom back from Bandar and were killed. On the Crypt, Bandar represents himself as a devoted brother to Kestrel, but Bandar is not actually in the Crypt, and he murdered Kestrel. Kestrel is called Lord and Ruler of the West Country in his coffin. Bandar usurped Kestrel. Kestrel, and that's probably not really Kestrel, is also wearing a coronet, a lesser crown. Never at peace while he lived, and yet to find peace beyond the grave, is implying his soul still exists and is not in oblivion. So, we might presume his soul was either annihilated or did end up in oblivion. The deeds of Kestrel Etrivion is on the mural, along with Lord of the West Country again. It depicts Bandar being the one responsible for Kestrel's accomplishments. The grisly frieze in the Crypt is more difficult to interpret, in homage to that which defies death itself. On the surface, death is I.C.E. The hooded figure in the landing temple calls her death. In principle, this should mean Empress Kadaena within the gemstone context, but it probably doesn't. Like follower of the dark path on the outside, the truth is less humble, because the undead leave Bandar offerings deep underground in his shrine. So really, this is saying in homage to Bandar Etrivion. It is mockingly defiant, perhaps. By the end of the story, Bandar is tormented and utterly mad. Supposedly he gives up his soul to the powers he was promised to long ago, whereas he portrays himself under the graveyard as some sort of lord of death in the underworld, perhaps Ordainers symbolism, immolating himself in ice, becoming demonic in the void. Or it could mean Kadaena, but be inverted from that point, with Kestrel's soul having gone to oblivion, so Bandar giving himself up to oblivion. There's no way to tell which of the possibilities is intentional. The everything is backwards theme makes a jumble of it. So it has been about an hour and a half, so I will stop the episode at this point. In the next episode, I will explore the death mechanics and religion in Gemstone, especially versus its Shadow World context. Then I will elaborate the dark mirror that I think the graveyard forms against it. After the death episode, we will look into allegory with the real-world literature and mythology I think was used for the graveyard. Thank you for watching this third episode of my Graveyard Exploration series. Hopefully you have learned something worth knowing, because knowing is half the battle.